Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy that you could attend this talk. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today for the Presley Center, Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo, an Assistant Professor of Sociology at UT Austin, who also serves on the City of Austin's Public Safety Commission. He has a wide variety of research interests that include police culture and behavior, public perceptions of police legitimacy, gun violence and prevention, and gangs and social networks. Impressively, Michael also employs diverse methods to explore these topics, including network analysis, ethnography, field experiments, surveys, and more. You can ask some questions about the methods after the talk. His publications appear in top journals such as Criminology and Criminology and Public Policy, Law and Society Review, and a bunch of other places as well. The focus of today's talk is on his forthcoming book, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of U.S. Policing. And we'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please hold your questions until then, unless you have a clarification question, and then you can sort of raise your hand and interject. So please welcome and join me in welcoming Dr. Sierra-Arévalo.
For the wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It means a lot that you took time out of your schedule. Lovely Friday afternoon. We'll try and make it worth your while. I'm really happy to be here to share with you, thankfully now, a book that it's almost done. It should be coming out in the spring of next year, finishing reviews, so finish line is in sight. So this book project, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, is based on my ethnographic research on how the preoccupation with violence and the possibility of death shapes police culture and practice across 3 urban police departments in the United States. Now, before jumping into the specific project, I think it's useful to provide a little bit of context about how I came to this particular area of interest and the circumstances that preceded my entree into this work, which ended up shaping how I chose to approach my questions about policing. So dredging back now into what feels like the very distant past, I arrived in New Haven, Connecticut in the summer of 2012 to start my Ph.D. in sociology. And when I went to graduate school, I was actually set on studying street gangs. And so coincidentally, and unfortunately, New Haven, unlike most cities throughout the early 2000s, had experienced a sharp uptick in homicides. And in fact, its 2011 homicide count just missed the all-time highs from the late 80s and 1990s that mirrored violence patterns in many US cities at the peak of the so-called crack epidemic. And so to address the violence, the city of New Haven started Project Longevity, which is a focused deterrent strategy modeled after Boston's ceasefire's work, spearheaded by folks like David Kennedy in the early 1990s, that combines police, social services, and community members to reduce gun violence that is driven by community-involved groups. Now, I was fortunate to get pulled into this project early to help with data collection on gun violence, on street groups, through a process that are known as group audits, sort of like a roundtable style meeting with police officers, social service providers, and street outreach workers to collect information on the individuals who are involved in shootings, both as perpetrators and very often as victims themselves, and the groups in which they are embedded. The kind of information that you collect this kind of stuff looks like this. This is just a simple network diagram of a set of groups in New Haven. The groups were scaled by the number of conflicts in which the groups were involved. And so instead of just reactively flooding an entire neighborhood, an entire part of the city with police officers after a shooting, the collection of those kinds of data allows you to tailor social services and a much broader array of interventions around individuals who are at high risk of gun violence, instead of, again, just flooding a neighborhood with police officers. So this early work with longevity was really important in forming my interests on issues of urban inequality and gun violence and policy. But policing, though very obviously a part of longevity, was not really at the center of how I was thinking about my research or thinking about things generally. And in fact, my plan at the time was to continue working on longevity. I was thinking about doing a dissertation about longevity as a case study, trying to understand the relationships between various stakeholders in the community, police officers, social service providers, and then, of course, the young men that were part of this particular intervention. And that was the plan up until Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And in the weeks that followed, as it became clearer and clearer to me that this was not just a flashing moment in the news cycle, I began to learn for the first time, along with a lot of other people, just how little we actually knew about police and policing in the United States. Years before journalists and activists began to compile their own data on police use of force and police misconduct, I was shocked to find that we didn't know how many people were shot by the police every year. To the very day, we only know how many are fatally shot. We don't know how many people are non-fatally shot by police. I may be even more shocked to learn that we don't even have reliable measures of how many police there are. Until just last year, our most accurate census of law enforcement personnel was from 2008. Our most recent estimate is already 5 years old. And so I learned all these limitations of official policing data as policing took an increasingly central place in discussion of inequalities, not just in the criminal legal system, but in areas of education and health and the labor market. And it was then that I began to see the need to understand not only how policing's negative consequences affect the lives of the public, but how the institution of policing itself is structured. That is, how and why US policing continues to perpetuate inequalities in punishment and beyond. So as a complement to the wide and growing body of work that documents the lived experience and outcomes of those who disproportionately bear the brunt of state coercion and violence, my research attends to the most visible and contacted agents of the criminal legal system, through whom state power is conducted, and whose decisions have profound consequences for public well-being. The danger imperative flips the analytic lens to focus on police officers themselves, the organizational infrastructure, occupational culture, and institutional processes that undergird the institution of policing. So by focusing on the seemingly egalitarian, colorblind laws, policies, and processes that comprise the structural and cultural drivers of police behavior, this research enables us to understand inequalities in policing not as aberrations, but as the tragic, logical outcomes of policing's underlying structure. And though it would take some time for my own interest to really solidify on danger and how death and how these concerns affect police work, the reality of violence on patrol actually became very clear to me very soon after I entered the field, very soon after the events of Ferguson. And that's actually where the danger imperative begins. On the afternoon of December 20th, 2014, New York City's holiday season was in full swing. The famous Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center, that year it was a Norway spruce from Danville, Pennsylvania, rose 85 feet into the air, and thick crowds perused the window displays of Fifth Avenue. Across the East River in Bedside, Brooklyn, a smaller 25-foot Canadian spruce twinkled at the corner of Marcy Avenue and Fulton Street, a festive reminder of the holiday bazaar and musical performances that accompanied the tree lighting just a few weeks past. Now, a little over a mile north of Marcy and Fulton, adjacent to the Tompkins houses, NYPD officers Wen-John Liu and Rafael Ramos sat in their police car on loan from the 84th precinct in downtown Brooklyn. Now, in all likelihood, Liu, the son of Chinese immigrants who came to New York when he was 12, and Ramos, a lifelong Queens resident, were engaged in one of the infinite mundane tasks of police work. They might have been writing paperwork on their car computer, they might have been asking about one another's families, or they might have just been taking shelter from the winter cold. Before getting back to the job of addressing the violence that had prompted their assignments to Tompkins houses in the first place. But the violence that would strike at the corner of Myrtle and Tompkins Avenues on December 20th, 2014 would not be the kind that Liu and Ramos were there to address. Instead, at about 2:45 p.m., Ismail Brinsley, 28-year-old Baltimore man angered by the police killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, followed through on Instagram threads in which he stated, "I'm putting wings on pigs today. They take one of ours, let's take two of theirs." After telling two bystanders to watch what I'm going to do, Brinsley walked up to the passenger side where Liu was seated and opened fire, shooting both officers in the head at point-blank range. Now, after executing the officers, Brinsley fled into a nearby subway station, and as officers closed in on him, took his own life with the same weapon that he used to kill the two NYPD veterans. Later that night, outside the Woodhull Medical Center, where the officers' bodies were transported, Patrick Lynch, the president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, or PBA, blamed Liu and Ramos' deaths on anti-police brutality activists who, quote, incited violence on the street under the guise of protest. Soon after, the PBA released a dire memo that recalled the 1970s when, quote, police were ambushed and executed on a regular basis, and proclaimed ominously that we have, for the first time in a number of years, become a wartime police department. We will act accordingly. 2 months later, in an echo of the commissions that were spurred by the police brutality and urban riots in the 1960s and 1990s, President Barack Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing was convened to chart a way forward in a rapidly forming crisis of police legitimacy. On the sixth and final day of testimony, Yusri Yoshikari, the director of public safety for Woodway, Texas at the time, argued for renewed funding of the Bulletproof Vest Partnership Program by emphasizing the increased danger facing contemporary police officers. He stated, being a law enforcement officer has always been a stressful and dangerous job. But currently, the law enforcement community is up against even greater pressures, challenges, and violence. Police officers face and witness profound danger on a daily basis. Later in the same session, Chuck Canterbury, the national president of the Fraternal Order of Police, echoed the same position, stating, "Now more than ever, we see our officers in the crosshairs of these criminals." Now, while it is true that armed street criminals, violent white supremacists, religious extremists, and active shooters pose very real threats to police and the public, claims of a policing profession that is more dangerous than ever, or that officers are now the targets of a so-called war on cops, are supported by emotion, rhetoric, and political maneuvering, but not by empirical data. Instead, available data on felonious police deaths show that the trend in such line of duty deaths has been decreasing for more than half a century. Compared to an annual average of 114 felonious police deaths throughout the 1970s, on average, fewer than half that number are killed each year since the start of the 21st century. Even when including non-fatal firearm assaults on police, the longitudinal pattern in such assaults is one of rarity and consistency. Combined with nearly 30 years of decreasing crime rates in the United States, the narrative of unprecedented danger and a war on cops is out of touch with the empirical reality of a policing profession that is safer than ever. I attend to the seeming contradiction and explore how, despite marked declines in officer injury and mortality, police officers continue to understand and practice police work as a matter of life and death. I conceptualize this orientation to policing as the danger imperative, a cultural frame that is defined by the preoccupation with violence, death, and the provision of officer safety. This cultural frame, I argue, constitutes the soul of policing, akin to what Ann Swidler has described as a style or ethos of action. This soul does not refer to some fundamental or essential nature of policing. As any social institution, policing is perpetually negotiated and contested, albeit feels very much strongly tilted in the favor of police. Nor is soul a normative term that speaks of policing as it should be. Instead, the danger imperative is a reflection of policing as it currently is. In this way, the danger imperative provides the means to better understand how and why policing operates the way that it does, and why it continues to reify social inequalities in the name of safety. Now, crucially, while policing and its preoccupation with danger is inextricable from a history rooted in slavery, colonialism, and racism, the contemporary manifestations of the danger imperative do not depend on racial animus. Just as social life writ large has increasingly moved towards so-called colorblind racism, police too have adopted ostensibly raceless language, procedures, and logics in their work. This does not say that virulent racism does not exist within policing. Examples of overt animus are all too common. In addition to racist social media posts and private communication, hundreds of officers and departments across the country have been linked to white supremacist and right-wing extremist groups. In a 2017 report, the FBI itself warned that white supremacist groups often have, quote, active links to law enforcement officials. But while such overt racial animus is undeniably present and too often allowed to fester within policing, the danger imperative does not depend on individual bigotry to encourage policing practices that perpetuate social inequalities in policing. Instead, the danger imperative, supported by formally a racial training, policies, and law, provides a cohesive and ostensibly neutral framework for officers to justify their behavior on the grounds of safety. Now, to understand how the danger imperative is constructed and perpetuated within policing, I observed and spoke with officers on patrol between 2014 and 2018 across 3 departments. On the East Coast, we have Elmont, or the EPD. On the West Coast is West River, or the WPD, and in the Southwest is Sunshine, or the SPD. These departments, spread across the US and embedded in distinct contexts, are all large urban departments tasked with responding to calls for service, ranging from low-level order maintenance to serious violence. By leveraging ethnographic observations and interviews across these disparate departments, the danger imperative is able to, despite differences across cities or departments or policies, elucidate the deep, unquestioned assumptions of police work that drive behavior and resulting inequalities that are endemic to the social role and function of the police institution writ large. From within these 3 departments and from the front seat of the patrol car, I show how officers practice police work in ways that privilege officer safety above all else, perpetuating a collective understanding of their work that centers violence and officer safety above all else. Now, in the interest of time and to spend more time on data today, I'm not going to detail things like gaining access to my field sites or building rapport with officers or my own positionality in the field effect of the data that I was getting. I would welcome questions about that in the Q&A, but I'm going to try and focus more today on the analysis. So the body of the book is structured as follows. Chapter 1 takes us inside the contemporary police academy and attends to how officers are socialized into a shared understanding of their perilous work and a set of behavioral strategies for staying alive. Under the tutelage of instructors already socialized into the danger imperatives preoccupation with violence and officer safety, recruits are taught to value their own violence as a righteous instrument that they must master to ensure their survival on the street. Chapter 2 describes how once recruits ascend to the status of sworn officer, the danger imperative is reinforced at every turn. In particular, the names and the faces of fallen officers are enshrined throughout the police department as a testament to the danger of their chosen profession. These commemorations, brought in memory of those killed on streets near and far in recent years and in decades past, coalesce into a shared understanding of policing's enduring danger. For the living who still stand on the thin blue line between order and chaos, the honored dead are constant reminders of the sacrifice which they may be called to make in defense of law, order, and the nation itself. Now, where chapter 2 focuses on symbols that speak to the most extreme consequences of violence emphasized by the danger imperative, chapter 3 attempts how the routine operation of the police department repeatedly amplifies the salience of deadly threat among police officers. During daily lineup meetings, sergeants and lieutenants focus on recent incidents of violent crime in their jurisdiction to enhance officer safety. Besides local violence, a vast information network transmits information, what I describe as danger signals between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as the military. These signals describe threats near and far, enumerating the enemies and the vast array of weaponry which police must prepare to confront on any given shift. YouTube, social media, and police-focused websites provide even easier access to these videos and other signals which reify the danger imperative. And over the course of their career, officers are repeatedly reminded that the threat to police anywhere, regardless of its rarity or its relevance, is a threat to police everywhere. And finally, chapter 4 shows how the danger imperative is reproduced in the minds and through the actions of officers set on returning home from their shift alive. Against the backdrop of police work's inherent uncertainty and the uniquely US problem of ubiquitous, easily accessible firearms, officers foster cognitive and behavioral strategies that they believe are necessary to ensure their safety on patrol. And while some of these behaviors are relatively mundane, engaged in as a matter of course, as much as to stay safe, others directly endanger the safety and well-being of the public. Further, policing structured by the danger imperative, even if codified in seemingly neutral legalese about threat and tactics and weapons and officer safety, can serve as a mechanism for biases concerning violence, criminality, and threat to shape broader inequalities in police behavior. In turn, this behavior, justified in the name of safety, also encourages antagonistic interactions between officers and the public that undermines police legitimacy, compromises public well-being, and even leads to the injury and death of police officers. So today I will draw on data specifically from chapters 1, chapters 2, and chapter 4 to show how officers are formally socialized to understand their work is dangerous, how the organic, informal commemoration of fallen officers helps to reify the danger imperative within and across departments, and how officers' shared understanding of police work as a profoundly dangerous affair manifest in damaging behaviors that, while justified as necessary to ensure officer survival, contribute to enduring inequalities in policing. And so just one last brief note about the data that I'm going to present to you. Any of the text that you see in italics is drawn from my field notes, so that those things are not verbatim, it's things that I observed, including conversations. Plain text is drawn directly from recorded interviews, so verbatim interview texts. So, beginning with the first chapter of the book, of all the lessons that are learned in formal training, none is more important than the need for officers to ensure that they return home alive. Nowhere is this lesson clearer than in the police academy. To ensure that officers understand this lesson, academy curricula emphasize the life or death stakes of police work and the consequences of not taking the steps necessary to stay safe. So following a 10-hour shift in late July, I met up with Officer Alonzo and Officer Digler for some Saturday night drinks. And I mentioned a video that I had seen to them in which a South Carolina state trooper shoots an unarmed black motorist who leaned into his car to get his driver's license. And so between sips of his beer, Officer Digler, who's also an academy instructor, he suggests that this shooting was tied to academy training in which trainees are taught, as he said, that everybody wants to murder. So Digler described one of these training scenarios to me in which he plays the driver of a stopped vehicle that contained a Sims gun in plain view. A Sims gun is a simulation pistol. Sometimes it shoots infrared, sometimes it shoots little paint pellets or plastic beads. And the Sims gun is supposed to be there so officers can see it. That's the whole point of the drill. So Digler explained to me, if the trainee doesn't see the gun in the course of that faux traffic stop, if he doesn't see the gun, you kill the cop. If he doesn't see the gun, when he walks back to his car, you get out and you fucking murder him. But the problem is that you put them into that mindset Alonzo, who was seated next to us, distilled that mindset very concisely. You're going to die. So beyond these flesh and blood training scenarios, which use real officers and real instructors, online platforms like YouTube also provide a bottomless pool of real-world examples of just how unpredictable and dangerous police can be. These videos focus on calls for service that have, quote, gone bad, amplifying the salience of these rare events for newly initiated police recruits. Officer Estasio remembered having seen such videos and their effect on him when he was in the Elmont Police Academy. He recalled to me, yeah, we see lots of videos of officers dying, officers calling out for help. Their mic is keyed in and we're hearing their last breaths, their last words. It hits home. Officer Michelson is also an EPD officer, and he recalled being shown videos in the academy. He told me, yeah, they show a bunch of videos of stops, dash cams, body cameras to show you how things can go wrong really quickly. They show you videos to, I don't know, I guess to show you not to make any assumptions, to not let your guard down. And he remembered one video in particular, which shows the 1998 murder of Deputy Kyle Dinkheller in rural Georgia, an event that a recent law enforcement publication described as, quote, forever seared in the minds of police officers across the world. Nearly 20 years since Dinkheller's murder, and years since he himself had actually seen that video, Michelson recalled the video to me with notable detail. So he begins explaining it to me. The guy gets out of the car, he's dancing in the middle of the street, he's telling the officer to shoot him. And then he gets up in the officer's face and he's screaming at him. If you get up in my face like that and you're being aggressive, I'm gonna go hands-on. But this officer didn't. And the suspect, he goes back to his car and he starts loading a rifle. The whole time the officer is screaming at him to stop, to get down, but the guy won't listen. And then he comes back out with a rifle and the guy starts firing. The officer tries to take cover, but the suspect just keeps shooting. He eventually reloads, then he comes around the back of the car and he executes the officer. It was crazy. Such videos are dramatic proof of the violence that police must be ready for when on patrol, showing in grisly detail why officers must be constantly prepared to confront an attack by a member of the public, as well as the deadly costs of complacency and an unwillingness to use violence themselves. Even after officers graduate the academy, they are required to attend periodic in-service training that formally reinforces the preoccupation with potential violence that is at the heart of the danger imperative. And I observed officers in Sunshine take part in such in-service training that was focused on firearms. So part of the in-service training focused on these video-based scenario training, which is pictured here. This is a now data system called the Prism. It's a 2D image. Much fancier versions now are completely wraparound, high-definition video. Big departments like the NYPD and LAPD now use virtual reality simulations. But the basic premise is the same. Officers come into this virtual training, and it requires them to practice making split-second decisions about when and how to use violence. These training systems allow instructors to alter various features of the video scenario, forcing officers to make critical shoot, don't shoot choices based on the behavior of the characters that are on the screen. So what you can't see here is the training officer is just off screen, and they are manipulating what's going to happen on the screen. They can choose the person drops the gun, the person points the gun, the person shoots the hostage, the person points the gun from the hostage to you. It's completely at the behest of the person controlling the scenario, meaning they know what actually would happen, which is very different from the real world. Now, in one scenario, Officer Stewart arrived on scene to a landlord-tenant dispute. It's actually the exact same dispute that's shown here, between two men outside this house. And so you hear raised voices, and there's an argument. You hear words like rent, and two men are angry. It instructs the tenant, who's at the bottom of the steps, to come with him and step away from the porch. This is very common during arguments. You try to separate parties who are arguing to prevent things from escalating. And so Stewart continues to call to the tenant. The landlord barks out, "Deal with this guy, because if you don't deal with him, I will." The landlord storms back in the house. And so Stewart, according to his training, commands him to come back outside. You don't just let somebody go into a house. You don't know what's in there. That's the premise behind maintaining control of the situation. And a few months later, the man does reappear on the porch, except this time he's carrying a shotgun. And so Stewart immediately unholsters his pistol, takes aim at the landlord and yells at him, "Drop the gun." And then less than a few seconds later, and without further command, Stewart fired several shots. The image on the screen freezes. Two blue dots appear on the man on screen where his infrared pistol shots landed, and the scenario is over. And so there's usually a debrief afterwards. And I asked Stewart, "What were you thinking when you chose to shoot?" And he explained it to me very concisely. He said, "Well, he made the choice to go back in and back out with a gun. Him walking out with a gun is already a threat. I gave him a verbal command to drop it. He didn't. And at that point, I would fear for my life." Sergeant Baker, who's the officer seated just off camera here, the training officer who's controlling the scenario, viewed Stewart's decision as quote unquote reasonable, drawing on that legal standard established in Graham v. Connor that currently governs all officers' use of violence. Even though Baker knew that he had selected a branch in which the landlord would not raise his weapon. He explained, I don't have a real problem with that. The idea on this scenario is the guy doesn't pick the gun up. But then again, who walks in when two cops are standing out there, grabs a shotgun and walks back out again with a gun? When he pulls a shotgun up, how long does it take? Not even half a second to get that shotgun downrange. I won't critique that shot. That was reasonable. That Baker knew the suspect would not actually shoot is almost beside the point. What matters is that the suspect could have raised the firearm at Stewart at any moment, creating a situation which Baker thinks a reasonable officer would respond to with deadly force. These shoot, don't shoot scenarios, along with videos of interactions gone bad, magnify the perceived likelihood of exceedingly rare but catastrophic events in officers' understandings of their work. Ultimately, this reinforces the necessity of the danger imperative and officers' need to be ever ready to fight for their lives. Now, outside of formal training, the perils of police work are reflected and perpetuated by powerful symbols or cultural artifacts within the police department that create a shared organizational memory of danger and death. The most overt of these commemorative artifacts is the memorial wall. And these walls take many forms. Some are abstract, like this golden wall outside of the headquarters of the Los Angeles Police Department. Others are decorated with officers or lions cast in bronze. Others are made of stone. In West River, a stark slab of marble stands in the lobby of police headquarters. The name and the end of watch date of every officer killed in the line of duty since the founding of the department chiseled into its black expanse. Now, this wall serves as tangible evidence of policing's deadly stakes and confirms that danger is a historical constant in policing. Lieutenant McWilliams of the WPD explained that the wall is a way to pay homage, he said, to those that made that type of sacrifice. He continued, explaining that it's respected so that they're not forgotten. And it's not just for the fellow officers, for the people that knew them. He said, there's a historical perspective. It's one of the things that we talk to our academy classes about. He said that he tells them, as you're getting your head wrapped around doing this job, you need to realize that it's not going to be all sunshine and daisies. Take a look at that wall. Those were all good folks that started off sitting in a chair just like you did. Further, death unites departments and officers across time and space to a shared appreciation for the danger of their work that transcends any one department or its fallen officers. On the night of July 7th, 2016, I was entering a Sunshine substation for a graveyard shift. And so I'm outside of the station. I usually have to get buzzed in by a sergeant. And so I'm on my phone, checking Twitter. And that's when the first reports of something happened at a protest in Dallas begin to come in, at a Black Lives Matter protest. We go inside the building, we sit down, officers are getting messages on their internal group me. They're also on social media. There's rumors that they found somebody with a rifle. There's pictures of him and ended up not being that person. All this is happening over the course of the shift. And over the next 10 hours, I learned that alongside officers themselves, that the death count was mounting. And then on July 8th, Dallas awoke to this headline. Now, between this news release and when I went to sleep that next morning at around 7:30, 8 o'clock, the death count would eventually rise to 5, marking the single deadliest day for law enforcement since 9/11. Now, after 2 weeks, during which Sunshine officers and officers across the country donned black mourning bands across their badges, I saw these funeral pamphlets in an SPD substation, a tangible commemoration of fallen officers saved by an SPD officer who had traveled to Dallas to attend these officer memorial services. That this tragedy occurred hundreds of miles away and claimed the lives of officers with no direct connection to the SPD or its officers is immaterial. The ambush of officers in Dallas, despite social and geographic distance, is commemorated through such cultural artifacts that are clear evidence of the danger that all officers face, regardless of the city or town that they happen to patrol. And what's more, these powerful symbols are not restricted to recent deaths. In another SPD facility on the wall opposite from where the images of fallen SPD officers hang, these two framed images commemorate the NYPD officers killed in the September 11 attacks. These commemorative artifacts tie the organizational memory of the SPD to a broader occupational level understanding of the danger inherent to police work, connecting officers not only across geographic space, but also time. And I asked Lieutenant Pinelli, who at the time was the watch commander of the substation, to explain why. Why do you have these images of officers that are not your officers? Why do you do that? And she explained, well, it's that public safety family. and we honor their sacrifice. When you become a member of the law enforcement community, you become part of a larger family, and you bleed blue. So when you lose somebody, whether or not they're in Dallas or Baton Rouge or New York, your heart breaks because they're a member of your family. They're a member of the law enforcement family. In turn, the shared understandings of police work as profoundly dangerous, constructed through both formal and informal mechanisms within the police department, constrain officers' perceptual and behavioral practices on patrol. For example, when officers graduate the academy and they first hit the street, they're encouraged to foster what I term the technical imagination, a sort of cognitive strategy in which officers mentally rehearse a wide range of dangerous what-if scenarios and what they would do if those scenarios were to pass. Lieutenant Pinelli posed one of these scenarios to me when we talked over lunch. So I was asking her about, how's training? She said that she was an FTO or a field training officer. So I was like, tell me about being a field training officer. What's that like? So, well, one thing that we do is we play the what-if game. So what's the what-if game? So, okay, it's like this. Imagine that we're stopped at a red light. So what happens if the driver of the car in front of you jumps out and points a gun and just starts firing at you? What are you going to do? And then she asked me a bunch of questions as if she would ask a recruit, a brand new officer just graduated. So what would you do? Are you going to put the car in reverse and just high speed backwards? Are you going to get on the radio and call for help? Are you going to pull your gun and shoot? These would all potentially be appropriate responses. But what is the best response for this particular scenario? It literally is really just to get you to think on your toes a little bit, because in this profession, you do have to make those split-second decisions. Other officers describe using their tactical imagination to envision any number of potential threats, from the potential for a random bystander across the street to pull a concealed machine gun out and fire at us, to the possibility that a gunman might begin opening fire in a mall while that officer was off duty, getting a massage. Officers went so far as to try and prepare me for the possibility of potential violence. So multiple officers took time at the beginning of a ride-along, for example, to show me where they kept medical kits or heavy ballistic armor in case we encountered rifle fire while we were out of patrol. They told me how to use an IFAC, it's an emergency medical kit, and how to use hemostatic powder, which is poured into wounds to cause chemical burns, essentially, to stop the bleeding, or to use a tourniquet. They didn't know that I happened to know how to use these things, but they just assumed it would be useful for me to know where it was in case we came under fire. Others showed me, even more specifically, how to do certain things to defend myself. So these are two simulation firearms. This is a very common model of firearm lock that you'll see inside of a patrol car. So one officer, as soon as we get in the car, before we even go on a patrol, says, oh, by the way, this is how you unlock the shotgun in case you need to use it, in case you need to defend yourself. Another officer who didn't have a shotgun or a rifle explained to me how to take his pistol out of his holster. So this is what's called a level 3 retention holster. There's multiple levels of retention here. There's a loop up here, which has to be disengaged. And there's a button on the inside, which has to be depressed. And then you can remove the firearm. He walked me through how to do it in case he said he was shot and I needed to defend myself or defend him with his pistol. Now, besides the use of their tactical imagination, officers also engage in observable behaviors, things that you can see, tangible things oriented by their preoccupation with violence. Now, some behaviors are subtle. For example, officers, when they're speaking with you, they might angle their hips away from you to keep their firearm further away from somebody while they're talking to you, to prevent the ability for that person to simply grab their firearm. Something very small, something very subtle. Or officers will use what's called a particular POI, or position of interrogation. And they assume a very simple bladed stance. And so if anyone has taken any sort of boxing training, that's essentially what this is: one foot forward, one foot back, put their hands up by their chest. And this is designed so that officers have a better ability to push, to block their face, to punch. They blade their feet so they can move easily backwards and forwards. They can't be pushed over. It also allows you to more quickly assume what's called a Weaver shooting stance. This is a very commonly trained shooting stance in police academies and just shooting more generally, preferred by some officers because it actually shrinks the profile that's exposed to gunfire coming in as opposed to being straight on. You're intercepting aim. This particular POI is understood as being particularly useful in this regard. Now, when performing a traffic stop, officers also make sure to touch the trunk of the stopped vehicle with a taillight before approaching the driver's window. So if you're seeing Officer Menendez engage in this behavior in West River, and I'd seen it before in Elmont, but it wasn't until I saw him doing West River that something went off in my head. Oh, I've seen that before. I asked him to explain why he was doing that. Why did you touch the trunk of the car? And he explained to me that, oh, it's to make sure the trunk is closed, to make sure there's no gunman waiting in the trunk to ambush police officers. I asked him, okay, has that ever happened to you? He said, no. I said, okay, do you know any time it has actually happened to a police officer? He said, no. And so I continued to push and I asked him, okay, well, can you recognize that the probability of there being somebody in the trunk with a gun waiting to ambush you is not very, very low? And he responded very simply, yeah, it's low, but that's how we're trained. We train for the worst case scenario. We don't train to stop granny. We train to expect someone to have a gun to try and hurt us. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. People do fight you. Now, how officers stand or whether or not they touch the trunk of a car, this might all seem like relatively low stakes behaviors. But other behaviors constitute uses of force that infringe on individual liberty and actively threaten the well-being of the public. So back in Elmont, an officer that I was riding with one night was trying to provide backup to another officer who had stopped a red Jeep Liberty for not using a turn signal and driving a busted taillight. So we get to the scene, and I can already see there's probably 4 or 5 other officers already there. And I got closer to the stopped vehicle, and I saw that there was one man in the back of a car, heavy-set black man. And I got closer to the car that was actually stopped and started asking questions. What happened here? He said, oh, there was a car stop. There was marijuana on the floorboards by the man who's now in the car. There's a bulge near his groin, so we're going to take him to lock up. We'll do a search. We believe that he's probably hiding drugs in his groin, but we're not going to search him here. I said, okay. On the curb, there were 2 more individuals, young black man, young black woman, probably in their late teens, early 20s, and they were handcuffed. And so they were handcuffed like this. It's the middle of the night, it's quite cold. Their jackets have been removed, they're on top of the car. And so Officer Glenn was the officer who initiated the stop and who handcuffed these 2 individuals. And I asked him, why are they handcuffed? He explained to me, well, when I pulled the car over, it was just me. It's for my safety. There was nobody else here. There were drugs in the car. The guy was in the car, the one who was already in the back of the police car was a parolee. So it's for safety. I didn't have any backup. But I looked around, and there was now a half dozen officers on scene. And so I asked him, okay, well, there's like 5 or 6 officers here now. Could you not just uncuff them? It seems like things are under control, so why not just uncuff them? Glenn's rationale, though still focused on safety, now shifted and began to focus on safety during the subsequent search instead of the initial stop. We did not have any backup. So he explained again, well, when we were performing the search of the vehicle, it's just safer. I don't have to worry about somebody swinging on me when my head's in the car. It's just something I don't have to worry about if they're cuffed. If they're cuffed, I don't have to worry about them, and I know that they're secure, and there's officers watching them. A short while later, after the vehicle was searched and nothing else was found, the couple was uncuffed and they were released. Now, though this encounter did not result in arrests or more severe levels of force, it nonetheless highlights the salience of officer safety and the preoccupation with violence that informs behaviors that anger communities, and which are far more common than shootings or high-profile cases of police brutality. The need to ensure officer safety at all times motivates the behavior of officers like Glenn, who can draw on the unquestioned and very flexible logic of the danger imperative to justify the intention in handcuffing of 2 citizens guilty of, at absolute worst, traffic violations in the possession of marijuana. Now, in other moments, the danger imperative pushes interactions to a point that is actually poised to erupt into violence at the slightest provocation, creating circumstances primed to escalate into tragedy. Now, during a slow shift in Elmont, I was with Officer Erickson. We're doing laps in his district when he drove past a small group of Latino boys that were walking on the sidewalk. They were no older than middle school, maybe early high school, or kids. So he stopped cold in the street and looked into his rearview mirror. He's muttering like, "These shitheads." So I asked him, "Do you know who they are?" And he said, "No, but I should." So with that, he puts his car in reverse, starts backing down the street, and he never took his eyes off of the kids. He's staring into the rearview mirror the whole time. So before stopping by the boys and rolling down his window, he unholstered his pistol and put it in his lap. His right hand was wrapped around the pistol grip, and his index finger was lying alongside the frame of the pistol, not in the trigger guard, parallel to the barrel, pointing at the door, and beyond that, the group of young boys. And so he asked the boys by now who have noticed the police car stopping and coming back. They've all stopped. They're all watching the police car. And so he just asked them, "You guys staying out of trouble? You doing good in school?" One kid called out, "Yeah, I'm making straight A's," which got laughs from his friends. Another added quietly, "I'm definitely getting some D's though." And with that, Erickson concluded the interaction. He told the boys, "All right, you guys stay out of trouble. Have a good night." And as he drove away, he reholstered his pistol and told me, unprompted, "I always do that when I'm just talking to someone out the window like that. You never know. They would have been able to shoot us in a split second if they wanted. That's why I keep it down here, relaxed, finger off the trigger. But you have to be ready for that. You have to always have a plan of attack. Now keep in mind, Erickson did not fire his weapon. No children were shot. This brief interaction did not end in tragedy. Nonetheless, Erickson's preoccupation with potential violence, even from a group of boys who he did not know and did not suspect of committing any crime, created an encounter poised at the point of no return. A single furtive movement, a shadow, a mistake, an ignored or unheard command away from catastrophe. These behaviors, both subtle and shocking, are part and parcel of the danger imperative. Across Elmont, West River, and Sunshine, officers socialize to see and engage with the public as if every call, every conversation might suddenly erupt into violence, demanding that they approach every interaction as a potential fight for their life, always ready to survive the worst. And because policing is distributed unequally across the population, the dire outcomes of this police activity are disproportionately borne by our most vulnerable. These existing inequalities and pervasive assumptions about race, place, crime, and violence continue to funnel police into marginalized communities, reproducing the iconic ghetto described by scholars like Elijah Anderson and the implicit biases that research shows are linked to perceptions of racial and ethnic minorities as suspicious, threatening, criminal, and violent. As it stands, the current arrangement of policing virtually ensures that the young minority men most likely to be perceived as dangerous will be contacted by officers preoccupied with the possibility of violence. By the same token, the history and continued practice of policing oriented by the danger imperative all but guarantees that police-public interactions will continue to unfold amid conditions of suspicion and sometimes naked antipathy, fueling a cycle of mutual distrust that not only further damages the legitimacy of police necessary for cooperation, but which actively produces tense, antagonistic interactions that are actually more likely to escalate into violence that harms public and the police. I argue that enduring inequalities in who is stopped, searched, arrested, and shot by police cannot be fully explained by bad or biased apples. Instead, the broader constellation of laws, policies, and culture that structure policing, even if codified and perpetuated through colorblind language of tactics or officer safety or threats, ensure that police behavior guided by a preoccupation with danger and death disproportionately concentrates in poor minority communities that are left over-policed and underprotected. Further, by shaping patterns in how police and their coercive power are distributed, the danger imperative is implicated in the reproduction of other social inequalities linked to the criminal justice system, including diminished educational attainment, damaged physical and mental health, labor market discrimination, and avoidance of key social institutions like hospitals, schools, and banks. These broader inequalities and disparities in police violence are intertwined by police that, because of the danger imperative, emphasizes the safety of officers above that of the public that they are sworn to protect and serve. I contend that not only stops and searches, but the tragic police killings, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Lando Castile, George Floyd, and Tyre Nichols, and far from many more, are best understood not as idiosyncratic errors, but as tragically predictable outcomes of the danger imperative. To borrow from Ta-Nehisi Coates, these tragedies and thousands of daily infringements on liberty are not evidence of our system malfunctioning. It is our system working as intended. So I thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Right,
sure, do you feel comfortable? Yeah, I have a question. So yeah, really interesting talk. I have lots of sort of thoughts racing through my head. One question is, so thinking about police reform, something that many of us think about and talk about, is wondering about the tension between training, protocol, you talked a lot about that, but also then individual and culture to some extent, but then individual discretion. And so where do these things kind of butt heads and do part? So some individual might have a higher propensity to interpret something through a lens of fearful, like there's danger here, or someone else might have a different propensity, right? So how does individual discretion and how someone responds, interprets, reacts to scenarios kind of factor into that, rather than have, obviously there's not like a uniformity necessarily. There's some uniformity, some homogenization, but there's also discretion. So how does that kind of work at odds with, at odds or at tensions with one another? Does that make sense?
So how does discretion or individual agency, how does that operate despite what is a story of like consistency?
Yeah, I mean, so you're talking a lot about training, protocols, these kinds of things, right? But then we know that people have their individual interpretation discretion. Sure. And so did you have instances where people talked about that? Did that create conflicts, departures, from what's protocol? Yeah, so there's certainly departures from protocol. So I asked the lieutenant very explicitly about Erickson's behavior, right? Putting a gun in his lap. And I just asked him, like, do y'all train that? He said, absolutely not, we don't train that. And that wasn't surprising that they got the answer. I don't think anybody trains recruits to put pistols in their lap to interact with a group of boys that have no reasonable suspicion, like nothing. That was, if not explicitly against policy, it's certainly not best practices or best tactics. That is actually just foundational to what policing is. If you remove the discretion, it's no longer policing. I think that what I try to point to with the danger imperative, which is a frame, meaning it's not deterministic. So it's very different from a model of culture, very Parsons, like download, and you have now software and you go out in the world and you're performing this culture because you downloaded it, and that is how it is. Officers always have discretion. I think that what I try to point to with the danger imperative is that this is a particular frame which is reinforced at all times. If you believe work by Sam Simon, who's done work on police academies, if you don't get in line early, you get kicked out. Because people that survive the academy are the ones who are most likely to at least perform this in the academy. It only operates in one direction. The frame only emphasizes threats from another person. And so what I didn't present on today, which is part of the behavior chapter, and it's in the paper in LSR, is about seatbelt behavior. So the frame is such that it tells you to emphasize some things. By definition, it also means that you have blind spots. And so one of their blind spots is that they don't wear their seatbelts when they drive around at high speeds. Why? Because they believe that's a threat to their safety because they can't get to their firearms. Despite the fact that driving around at high speeds without a seatbelt is infinitely more likely to result in your death or injury than being shot in the line of duty. And so the agency always exists. And I suspect that if I had a different methodology, survey-based, if I had administrative records of misconduct and force and other things, I could begin to maybe put officers on some sort of continuum within the frame, who's more likely to operate in a particular way within the danger imperative. The method is not suited for that. But I don't think anybody is operating in this frame in a way that that reverses itself. And so the agency is constrained by the frame, but the agency is always there. There is evidence to suggest that female officers, for example, will engage in use of force less often and less severe uses of force. There's work in Chicago from Bokar Law that shows controlling for a whole bunch of things, trying to make use of random assignment through shifts. So you have a sort of a pseudo experiment kind of thing. That Black officers use force against Black suspects less often than white officers. But I think an important point in that study is that Black officers still use force against Black suspects than white suspects. So the disparity is not as large, but there's still a disparity. And so part of my goal in this is to say, like, agency is there. Not everybody is like a character in the book that's Officer Cisneros, who's like designs knives in his spare time, does jujitsu, big Jordan Peterson guy, like I'm a sheepdog, they're wolves, like total prototype. It's incorrect to assume that everybody is Cisneros. But I think it's important that the academy thought it was reasonable to make him an instructor. And I think that's the point, is that this person fits within and resonates within the structure of the police department and the occupation. Yes.
Yeah. Prior to working with the Robert Presley Institute, I was the elected district attorney in San Diego County for 16 years, and we did hundreds of officer-involved shootings. And then most recently, I've been hired as a special prosecutor for various counties to determine an officer-involved shooting. Were you able to talk to any officers in those scenarios regarding this work and analysis?
So I'm very happy to say I did not observe any officer-involved shootings. I did talk to officers who've been involved in shootings. Okay. And in fact, multiple shootings.
Right. And it goes to your analysis of what you're saying. They're out there trying to survive, live, go home to their families, which is in their minds. Just about every one of them, I'd say 99.9% of them was, I want to go home. And I think I know is embedded in their minds when these scenarios occur. And then the other thing you mentioned, that these scenarios happen in seconds. A lot of people try and second guess the analysis and what happened, but they're sitting in a room like this with air conditioning going and trying to figure it out. But I understand then the next step, talking about how do we then transition that kind of training and protecting one's life, because I'm now good friends with a lot of retired police officers who say, I used to go to work and just want to get home. So how do we then transition that into, okay, we need to be a little bit more open to cultural differences and those things, those Hispanic boys walking down the street.
I mean, I don't know what cultural difference is on walking in a group.
Yeah.
I don't know what the cultural difference is.
I don't either. And why that, why that occurred. I mean, those are questions that I think we're all trying to answer as a society. But I do like what you're doing.
I think so. I guess my response, I don't know if there was a specific query there, but the response I think is I have made some of my colleagues upset when I say things like things happen very quickly. I've seen fights occur. It's true. It's a real thing, and you can't really understand that unless you've seen it. Or even the phenomenon of being in a fight. I think a lot of people don't actually know what it's like to wrestle with somebody or punch someone or get punched in the face. Like, that's a real thing. But there's a reason why I don't focus on shootings. There's a reason why I focus on decisions that happen orders of magnitude more often than the rarest cases, like stops and searches and handcuffing and detentions. I think that if you want to understand just how pervasive this thinking is, it's not just in the furtive movement in the alley during an active robbery call with blood on. No. This is happening with a group of boys doing nothing but walking in their community. And the logic is identical. The justification is the same. That suggests to me that this logic has spun out of control. It has become something almost self-perpetuating, self-feeding, and it allows officers to justify any number of things on the ground of safety. In the community, despite not being experts in policing, they smell it. They smell something's off when you can say everything is about safety. You were scared of the case in Colorado. I teach in my policing class. The man who was picking up trash outside of his house, and the officer came and said, "You have a weapon in your hand." And the guy says, "This is a bucket." But that's a real thing. But the logic is the same. So I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes. I guess my question is this. At the beginning, you showed the statistics of officer deaths and kind of how over the course of time, there's peaks and there's valleys, but it's basically decreased on a fairly consistent basis since the 70s. My recollection is that decrease kind of coincided with changes in police training, tactics, and equipment. So how do you balance the fact that the explanation for that drop in violence might be the fact that officers are preoccupied, to use your word, with violence, therefore making themselves conduct themselves in a way that is more safe for them. So, basically, do you account for the fact that the reduction in death might be precisely because of this, what you call preoccupation in death? And if that's the case, how do you then back away from that in a way that doesn't result in officer deaths increasing? Or is it your thought that they signed up for that, therefore if they die, it's tragic, but that's a choice that they made?
So it's certainly not the latter. I don't want more dead cops.
No, and I'm not implying that you wanted more dead cops, but
sure.
What I'm saying is that
I hear the question, right?
It's the balance.
Am I looking at symptoms or am I looking at outcomes? And so that is an open possibility. I think a large part of the discrepancy, a large part of the pattern is the introduction of ballistic armor. So that was felonious deaths. You would expect deaths to go down. The next figure, of course, is fatal and non-fatal, and that is flat. Now, granted, it's just for the past couple of years. I don't have it since the 70s, but the possibility still exists, and it's a reasonable one. Well, you're saying all these things they're doing to stay safe, like that could actually be driving their injury down. It could be working. What I'm pointing to is not saying that it's not going to work. I think that if you use chemotherapy for everything, it's going to work. There are costs.
Right.
And the people who bear the costs, in this case, are disproportionately innocent. They're disproportionately people of color. They're disproportionately people in poor communities. And so that, I think, is the overarching goal. It's not to say that this might not work. Sure, if you talk to everybody and cuff everybody, they're very unlikely to assault you because they are cuffed and on the ground. But what are you doing? You are using force against a lot of people, most of whom are innocent. When you do things like stops and searches, you are finding something in a very small percentage of cases. All the meanwhile, you are eroding legitimacy, you are damaging trust, and in some subset of those cases, you are injuring and killing people in the name of officer safety. And I think that's the tension that I'm highlighting. I am not going to be the person that gives you the estimate of the right number of dead cops or the right number of dead civilians. I'll leave that to some economists who will write that paper, and they would be the ones to write it. I'm pointing to what the costs are. And it's certain, the equilibrium is not this one. It's something else. Thank you for your question. Yes?
Yeah, and kind of piggyback on this question, also your response in terms of the communities that has to bear these costs, which are disproportionately low income minorities, right? And I think about, and going back to a student's question I had a couple of days ago, how do these officers navigate, how do they build this trust? This danger imperative exists. They're afraid for their lives, and at the same time, they're trying to protect the lives of the public. But how do they navigate the fact that some people don't want to call them? Response times are really long. It's going to take you hours to get to you, right? Because I'm in a place that you don't feel that you need to get to, or maybe my lives are not as valued. And so what do they do to navigate these kinds of issues? And I'm glad you were able to have that one-on-one interaction with them to see what that looks like and these split-second decisions that a lot of us don't really get to see and trying to really understand where they're coming from.
It's a great question. And it's frankly an irreconcilable tension. Peter Manning, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, wrote about the impossible mandate of policing. And the gist is that people expect the police to control crime when the police actually know full well, that police do not actually just have the ability to like throw a switch on crime. But that's the role that he calls like a dramaturgical theory of policing. Well, my role is to control crime, so I'm going to perform as if I have the ability to control crime, which is why I do the press conference with the drugs and the guns on the table, because we're very good at policing, we're controlling crime, even though you know full well that it's much more complicated than that. You can't just make crime go away. Add on top of that not only are you supposed to make crime go down, you have to do it in a way that doesn't make the community mad, something which police are not particularly well-trained or well-incentivized to do. So one thing that I harp on when I talk to people is you can't reward what you don't record. The only thing that police departments record reliably is arrests, seizures, stops, searches. If I ask a chief in any major department, I need to see your part 1 crimes over the past 6 months, they'll have that report for me in 10 minutes. If I ask them how many positive interactions you have in the community in the past 6 months, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy. There's just no infrastructure to record this kind of information. And so when rubber meets road, I think 2 things happen. Officers know, in theory, that cooperation is really important. And I think good officers, particularly veterans, they know that if they're going to solve a murder, it's because the house 3 doors down that they've been knocking on for the past 5 years, that they've gotten people out front from selling drugs a couple of times. And the old lady that lives there, she knows everybody. And she's seen everything. And she's going to be the person who solves the homicide. Not a crack team of detectives most of the time. Somebody saw it. But that doesn't change the danger imperative. It doesn't change that underlying assumption of the work. And I think the officers that are able to balance those things, they are rare officers and they are to be treasured. I think the reality is that you get a lot of 20-year-olds that sign up because they want to be on SWAT and they want to find guns and they want to find drugs. Those are not the people that are particularly likely to find the balance. we figured out a long time ago that you don't give 20-year-olds a rental car because they drink more, they fight more, they drive faster. But we somehow came to a place where it's reasonable to give handcuffs, guns, and arrest powers systematically to people whose frontal lobe is not finished developing yet. And so I think that there are officers that can find a balance. I think it is a bridge too far to just expect the average officer to actually be able to navigate that consistently.
You mentioned earlier about Graham v. Connor in regards to like when police are able to discharge their firearm. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about like any policy changes that have been influenced either here, like in the United States or more specifically California?
So I'm a social scientist that played lawyer on TV, so please, at the back of the room, if I say things that are just incorrect, correct me. There's some great legal work. I believe his name is Obisogi out of Berkeley Law. And so he was interested in how have departmental policies shifted to reflect the language of Graham v. Connor over time. Graham v. Connor, so he talks about the sort of relationship where Graham v. Connor was passed. For those that don't know Graham v. Connor, it essentially establishes a reasonableness standard that becomes the standard by which you measure any seizure or use of force specifically. And so you don't judge it with 20/20 hindsight, as in like, oh, I can see that the person wasn't armed, thus this is unconstitutional use of force. Instead, with what would a reasonable officer put in the same situation have done? So you can't do it with like high-res video. It's like this person said they saw this, they heard this, they smelled this, and they did this. What happened with policies is the policies adopted the language of Graham v. Connor. Now, the reasonableness standard is, I think, by any estimate, very vague. There is no empirical measure of what a reasonable officer is. It does not exist. And so the policies adapted reasonableness. Now, when you have use of force decisions in a court, very often they will look and see, well, what was the policy? The policy reflects legal precedent. And so you get to this weird tautology where the law is asking what's reasonable. The policy says that what's reasonable essentially is the law. And you get to a place where it's very difficult to find if something is actually unreasonable based on the premise of the reasonableness standard. I'm probably butchering the Obisogi argument, but that's one of it. He talked about this idea of like sort of like circular reasoning legally and policy-wise. California, I believe they changed the verbiage from reasonable to necessary, objectively necessary recently.
Yes,
right?
But it still talks about reasonably in the officer's mind, was it necessary? Right. So it really didn't change much at all as far as the law goes. But still, they do use the term necessary, but nobody really defined that. So,
right.
And the definition went back to what was reasonable.
Right. Yeah. So essentially, so the court has talked about various times that there is like an unreasonable, wink, wink, amount of deference to officer perception. That it essentially boils down to what officers say happened. And actually, video doesn't solve the problem unless you catch them in like a really egregious lie. But it's what the officer says. And there is a great paper, it's dated now, but the paper is How Reasonable is the Reasonable Man? And it talks specifically about this sort of tautology. That what's reasonable becomes necessary, what's necessary becomes reasonable. So you just get back to the same thing at the bottom where you're like, well, and this was before the standard even got changed. So that was the phrase. It just becomes a circle. And we know that there is in the public that there is, or at least I don't know if this has changed, frankly, but the tradition was a ton of deference to police perception. I'm sorry, I'm not a real lawyer.
What was the name of the other case that you said? Oh,
Obisogi is the author. He's a law professor at Berkeley. Obasogi. Obisogi and Newman might be that paper. I lost track of where the hands.
We have a question from our Zoom audience here who says, thank you for this talk. It is so important. Can you say more about these YouTube videos and how they also influence public opinion about police violence?
That's a good question. So back in the day, when I was a wee lad, and VHS was still a thing, departments traded videos. So like they would get a VHS video and that would go in a manila envelope. And that would either go in the mail or they would trade it in conferences or they'd trade it at, they get together at trainings, and they'd be like, oh, we have this crazy thing, like, you gotta check this out. And that's how it happened. These are in the scope of policing very rare. And they used to be very isolated. Dean Keller has stuck around, I think because policing generally has a real attachment to myth and attachment to story. It's also, The reason I don't show it, it's a horrifying video. The audio, so you don't see anything happen, it's the audio. You hear somebody dying and someone terrified. This is shown to kids, 20-year-olds in this academy. The internet changed that. The barrier that might have existed with access to hard copy tape is gone. And so no matter how rare the incidents might actually be, and in fact, we have all the evidence would suggest that these incidents would be becoming rarer over time. It's safer today than in 1990, for example. You're going to have access to it. And so it's availability bias. The denominator might actually be changing drastically, but I can actually see more of the rare events. I could show a new video every single day of the academy. I could show 2 new videos every single day of the academy. And as time goes on, I'll have ready access to new videos all the time. And there are some private companies that profit from this kind of media. So Police One is a very large, very popular policing media website. It was recently acquired by Lexipol, which now does like policy standardization for departments across the country. They also do training for large, so they are one of the largest training providers for Texas or people, Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. It's all for profit, it's all for money. And they send out newsletters. I get them, I subscribe to them. And the number one thing on the majority of these is a use of force. It is a case of an officer being treated unfairly. It's an officer being involved in a shooting, hero cop, et cetera. Like that is the messaging that they have found to generate what? Clicks, to generate what? Money. And so these private companies are not regulated. They're their own entities and they're out to make money. And they have found that there's a particular culture, particular topics and subjects that drive interaction, that drive clicks, and that make them. And violence is one of those things.
Thank you.
It's also not a cop thing. Everyone clicks on violence. But this is a profession, it's also the state, which I think makes it different. Yes?
Yeah, question about your methodology. You talked about observing academy training. And obviously you're watching firearms training and self-defense, that kind of thing. Did you have any experience in observing training in other domains, or even in those specialized domains of firearms and tactics and so forth, where any of the message is contrary to what you're talking about? Does anybody ever say in the academy, hey, let's be realistic about this? And by the way, we have a professional duty to treat people correctly, to not make enemies for the police department, all that. Does any of that, did you witness any of that?
So one point of clarification. So the things that I directly observed were in-service training. So it's after the fact, it's not recruits. I didn't observe any actual academy training. There are some videos that I saw of training. I talked to instructors. I talked to people who had just gone through training. So, but I didn't get to go to an academy. That's one of the limitations of my data collection. So the short answer is I don't have one, say one way or the other. So I know that in the actual curricula, it's listed. So respect and courtesy, cultural sensitivity is usually listed for some departments. Crisis intervention training is more popular now in large.
But all those subjects are also covered in service training, they're required.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't see any of that.
Well, they can't cover all the in-service in one day. There's only so many hours in the day. So I went on the firearms day and the whole day is firearms. I went on the drive training day, the whole day is driving training. So those things are offered. I think the clearest measurement of emphasis is just the number of hours on these things. You do on average 65 hours of firearms, 65 hours of DT, defensive tactics, 3 hours on respect and courtesy. You do these scenario-based training is actually kind of woven through all of it. And so in practice, even during courtesy and respect or de-escalation training, the option is always there to escalate that and force you to defend yourself, even if you're doing a CIT scenario with somebody who is suicidal or in a mental health crisis. The messaging is certainly there. I think that's very obvious, that those kinds of trainings happen. I would point mostly to my colleague Samantha Simon's work. She observed multiple police departments and their academies and went to the academies. She has a much more concrete ability to say, oh, they definitely covered this. And one example from her book, I've reviewed parts of it. It's like in the training on legitimacy, you're showing statistics on officers killed in the line of duty. Why? Why is this part of this training? So the danger imperative, we believe, what I've talked about is something that doesn't preclude you talking about respect and procedural justice and legitimacy and crisis intervention training. But once again, none of that changes that I need to be concerned for my safety at all times. Whether or not it's enough to override that, I don't think there's any evidence of that at scale. In fact, most of the evidence about things like procedural justice, it changes attitudes, but not change behavior. There's some new evidence from Chicago. There's very small effects. You didn't ask this, but I'm skeptical of the ability for CIT, for de-escalation, for procedural justice training to really move the needle on something as embedded and as multifaceted as it is.
May I follow up? But are you saying that, for example, de-escalation training is not worth doing, or just that it doesn't change the danger imperative?
Oh, it's definitely worth doing. Yeah, I'm not saying that you don't do it just because it's not going to fix the problem. I think that what I and other folks who have like, when you read the commission reports from 1920 and then 1950 and then 1970 and 1990 and then 2012, and they say the same thing, but they just change the buzzword, it becomes clear that by introducing a new thing, you get a checklist of things. A police chief who's responding to public pressure will say we did the thing. And there's an expectation that that might solve it. And it's very obviously not the case. So I can implement de-escalation. I think we should do de-escalation. I think that we should do crisis intervention. I think we should do all those things. But you said it right. It's not going to change the danger imperative. I think it sets unrealistic expectations about the effects of what's going to happen when we institute these new trainings. And unfortunately, people outside of policing and within policing are very quick to say, we did the new training, we're doing it right, we did the task force recommendations, like we should be good now. And then what happens 3 weeks later? There's another shooting, there's another YouTube video. The problems don't go away because of the new training. But some people seem to expect it to.
What do your participants think about your ideas in terms of the danger imperative? Do they know? I know the book isn't out yet, so they haven't read it.
No, I talked with them about it. No one denies that it's real. They're like, oh yeah, like this is all real. I went through that training. I've seen this. I think officers want to find the explanations for why it's reasonable. So one of the earlier questions, like, well, if we didn't do this, we would be dying more. And so like, gotta break some eggs to make an omelet, essentially. Like this is just the stakes. This is the price of admission. Like this is what you have to do in this country. We have a lot of guns in this country. I don't know what to tell you. Like it's dangerous out there. Like I'm gonna go home. Sometimes it boils down to them with things like, better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6. That's shorthand for I'd rather make a mistake and kill an innocent person than be put in the ground. Others have said, like, yeah, I've told my chief about this for years, that we shouldn't be sending our officers to, Dave Grossman's a very popular police trainer. He runs like these sheepdog seminars, warrior cop stuff. He's like, I don't know why we send officers to these things. I think this is bad. I don't think you have to do it that way to be safe. So other officers say, like, this is absolutely right. I've been saying it for years. I have colleagues in the Department of Justice, like behind closed doors, police chiefs have said things like, I have no control of the training my officers go to in their spare time. They can go do whatever training they want to go to. And I don't see what it is. I don't pay for it. It's out of pocket. This is much bigger than policing itself. So some officers think that I'm being overly critical and I'm not giving enough credit to just how dangerous their work is. Some officers are, frankly, like they're saying like, yeah, this is real, but it doesn't change anything. Some of the ones in the field have said things like, you could never understand unless you've done the job. And so the book just might as well not be done. Others, frankly, I was surprised. We're just very grateful that I was just asking them what they thought. I think line officers generally don't have anybody ask them what they think about anything. And so having somebody, I think having Yale is like the name. I think be asking very sincere questions about like, tell me what the hardest part of your job is. Have you ever been scared? How dangerous do you think your job is? I think that those questions resonated for them. But I don't know how they're going to react to the interpretations. I don't know. The ones that I have spoken to, they wouldn't come to the same conclusion, but they don't question the data. They don't question that it's real.
Yeah, and I guess my follow-up, if I'm allowed. So how did they come to trust you? Because you're obviously an outsider. And, that's sort of is connected to what I asked at the end. What do they think about your work? How do they come to trust you? How did you get to write along with them, given that you're an academic? And that there's a good chance that you're going to have, I wouldn't say an anti-policing stance, but a critical stance.
Sure. I mean, there's those sound all like similar questions, but they're actually very distinct. So writing around in a police car is not hard to do. Ride-along programs exist in most large departments. And so barring being very young or having a criminal record, you can probably go on a ride-along. Multiple ride-alongs can be trickier. So getting the access was through chiefs. That was the first step, was getting someone to sign the dotted line and saying, yeah, this guy can like ride around if he wants. I'll connect you with my assistant chief or my lieutenant, and they'll figure it out. That was one thing. I frankly don't know. In fact, I doubt that most officers trusted me. But a large part of what my entry into the field was iterative every day at lineup. So that was an opportunity for me to essentially I would ask the sergeant or lieutenant doing lineup, can I introduce myself? As opposed to having them introduce me as like, oh, he's just like a researcher. So can I give like my spiel? And the spiel was honest, and it was, hey, my name is Michael, I'm doing this project. After Ferguson, I heard from police chiefs and lawyers and activists, but I never heard from a police officer. I need your help to understand what this job is. I'm here to make my own conclusions about what policing is about and how you do your job. I didn't go into the nitty gritty. This is before I even had the idea of the danger imperative. Like I didn't tell them about that stuff. But I need your help. I need to understand what's going on. And they might feel you out with things, right? They'd be like, so Black Lives Matter, ... And I'd be like, what about it? And so I tried to put things back on. So there was definitely people that made assumptions about me because of Yale, because I'm Latino, because I'm young. I had certain things that I could leverage, right? I grew up in Texas, went to public schools. Being from Texas, for whatever reason, a lot of cops were big fans of that I was from Texas. But maybe like I wasn't like the most pinko commie elite liberal because I'm from Texas. I could very reasonably say like, look, like guns don't freak me out. I like shooting. I played rugby. I lifted weights. I had tattoos. I was the same age as a lot of cops that just came out of the military. So they did 4 years. They're back out. They're 22, 23. They've been on a year. I'm the exact same age. So there's an ability to talk about that there. I grew up working class, lower middle class. They would mention things about Yale and how expensive school must be. I'd be like, yeah, but I went to public schools and actually grad school was free. There were all of these things that I could, and my mom was a veteran. They loved that too. They loved that my grandpa was a police officer in Colombia. There were various things that I could insinuate that we were not so different and that actually were legitimate points of connection. And that moved us away from the assumption that I was there to write a hit piece. It also helped that I didn't reveal the city or their names. And that's what I gave in my spiel. I don't even give the name of the department. I'm not here to bury you. And even then, some people still don't trust us. This is a conversation for like an hour. We can talk about the positionality and report things a bit. Yes.
Yeah, as I said, we decided years ago. Your textbook, how do I get it? I'm teaching a law and justice class in the spring here.
My textbook?
Yeah, it's a book you're writing.
Oh, this book?
Yes.
Oh, this one is going to have far fewer pages. I hope it'll be a better read. It should be out in the spring of 24.
Through Amazon or through?
It'll be on Amazon, yeah. So it's coming through Columbia University Press.
Okay.
You can follow me on Twitter. I'll definitely announce it there. So
okay.
So we're a little last question. Go ahead.
Do we see the same preoccupation with violence among police officers in other countries?
Great question. You do see a preoccupation with violence among police in the UK or Australia. I always mention Jennifer Carlson's work that she's done specifically about police chiefs and guns, and their views about like essentially it's like white mass shooters and like Black Latino inner city interpersonal violence, like those are the two mental heuristics. But she has a phrase in there. It's about the particular imagery and intensity of U.S. policing, and I think that's the difference: the intensity of this preoccupation, the technology of the preoccupation. So it's not just whistles and sticks. It is semi-automatic pistols, taser, bolo wrap, patrol rifle, non-lethal or less lethal shotgun, lethal shot, like just the amount of stuff, the amount of procedure, the amount of infrastructure dedicated to the threat of violence is wildly different from other peer European nations. If you want to see a closer comparison case, honestly, go to Mexico or go to Brazil. and the police look very, very similar. It's obviously different in terms of policy. It's a military force versus a local force. But if you want to hear rhetoric, and I've talked to the Mexican police in the city of Mexico, I have colleagues who've talked to police in the favelas of Brazil, the rhetoric is eerily similar.
For the homicide rates.
Higher, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, our homicide rates are closer to Mexico and Brazil than they are to England or Japan.
For sure. And I hope that we don't go the direction of the police killers in that regard too.
Okay, so thank you so much. We're a little over time, so thank you so much for coming.